Let me continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life, by Michael Ignatieff. This is chapter 7, The Brothering, 1934 to 1940. And this is the second part of this chapter. I read the first part last time, mentioning that Isaiah got some friends to talk about philosophy. So let's continue. It was Isaiah's idea to broaden his tete-a-tete with Austin to include other young philosophers. One morning in 1935, while browsing in Blackwell's bookshop, he came upon Mind and the World Order, a work on the philosophy of knowledge by the Harvard pragmatist C.I. Lewis. Finding it an interesting and articulate statement of a pragmatic empiricism, he suggested to Austin that they give a class together on the book. Berlin was in for a surprise. Austin suddenly turned Grand Inquisitor when they were paired as teachers before a crowd of philosophical undergraduates. Quote, "If there are 3 vermilion patches on this piece of paper, how many vermilions are there?" End quote, he asked. Berlin said there was 1. End quote, "I say there are 3, said Austin, and then proceeded, in slow, formidable, and relentless style, to demolish Berlin's position, leaving Isaiah looking, so observers remembered, distinctly unhappy. It was a sign of his intellectual maturity that instead of fleeing Austin, Isaiah continued to seek him out. He went on to play an essential function as a philosophical go-between, mediating between the logical positivism of Ayer and the emerging skeptical language philosophy of Austin. Isaiah conceived the idea of a regular philosophical discussion involving the 2 of them. Between the spring of 1937 and the summer of 1939, the brethren met on Thursday evenings after dinner in Isaiah's rooms at All Souls. The magic circle was small. Ayer, Berlin, Hampshire, Austin, Donald McNabb, A.D. Woolsey, and Donald McKinnon. R.G. Collingwood was invited but declined. The brethren's chief topics of discussion were theories of perception, personal identity, and the possibility of knowing of other minds. The philosophical atmosphere of the room was full of the technical jargon of the Vienna Circle. Isaiah kept trying, so Hampshire remembered, to dispel the obfuscatory cloud by arguing that they should discuss plain and evident examples. To anyone outside the circle, the discussion might have seemed Martian. They debated, for example, whether one could tell if one person's headache was worse than another person's. If everything we know about the world comes to us through our senses, how do we know anything about the contents of other minds? Strict empiricism seemed to entrap each perceiver in a solipsistic world of his own perceptions. Likewise, if everything we know about the world comes to us through our senses, into what constituent blocks are our sense data divided? Suppose, Austin would say, you're looking at a visual field of 7 black strips and 7 yellow strips. Should one say that it consisted of 14 discrete units of sense data or 1 tiger's skin? The read Kafka's Metamorphosis together and considered Gregor Samsa's predicament, because it seemed to tell them something about the relationship between personal identity and the persistence of a memory. Was a Samsa a man with the body of a cockroach, or a cockroach with the memories and the consciousness of a man? Neither, Austin would declare. In such cases, we should not know what to say. This is when we say, words fail us. Words rarely failed. The evenings were noisy. One of their numbers likened the debates to hunting with a pack of hounds. On one occasion, Ayer shouted at Austin that he was a greyhound who didn't want to run himself, just bite the other dogs. There was a truth in this. Ayer at least had the Vienna doctrines to define. At this period, Austin did not have a position of his own so much as an infinitely painstaking talent for demolishing other people's. Austin had it in him to strike fear in others. Quote, "Would you mind saying that again?" End quote. He would inquire with a little stare. If you repeated it, he would intone in a thin voice. Quote, "It seems to me that what you have just said is complete nonsense." End quote. The meetings were duels of will as much as of intellect, and they left real wounds. This was no plaid shadow fencing, Isaiah later remembered, but a war to the death, my death, that is. What they were fighting about was the very status, purpose, and the nature of their discipline, whether philosophy should try to be a science, which questions were relevant and answerable, which ones were not, how progress in philosophy could be achieved. Such dueling might well have destroyed Berlin's self-confidence forever. It certainly showed him his limits as a philosopher. Yet he was not damaged by the discovery. As he said later, "I knew I wasn't first rate, but I was good enough. I was quite respected. I wasn't despised. I was one of the brethren." Austin characteristically worried that the discussions would be too casual, too slapdash, unless rigorously ordered. He wrote to Isaiah saying that philosophical discussions are usually nugatory and unedifying through lack of strict rules of procedure. He then set up the 4 pages of procedural suggestions, which would have been excessive in the House of Commons and were lunatic when applied to a body of 7 people. None of Austin's suggestions was adopted. Isaiah managed to keep Austin's procedural mania in check. Outsiders resented the circle. One philosopher came down from Leeds to read a paper in February 1938, and when he returned, he dispatched a scathing letter, observing that the Oxford philosophers published little and talked far too much. As even Isaiah was to admit later, we were excessively self-centered. We thought no one had anything to teach us. We were the only people we were trying to please. And when we persuaded someone in the circle that something was true, this satisfied us completely, too completely. And yet, sharing an intimate language and experiencing the vertigo of insight taught Isaiah what true intellectual happiness was. While he blossomed intellectually inside the circle, he became increasingly skeptical about logical positivism. He was among the first to see that there could be meaningful statements that did not fit either of Ayer's categories. Hypothetical conditions: if a horse named Charlie Monk had entered the race, it would have won, were meaningful, but by definition could not be verified empirically. There were also conceptual truths. Pink is closer to red than it is to black, which were meaningful, but whose truth, Berlin argued, was neither a matter of fact nor a deduction of logic. Ayer kept rebuilding the wall against such exceptions, insisting that color relations, for example, were a matter of fact. But Berlin came to believe that these examples vitiated logical positivism's central claim that all meaningful statements were either deductive or empirical. A similar puzzle emerged on the subject of the knowledgeability of other minds. If someone said he had a headache, how could you actually verify that this was true? Verificationism seemed to open up a solipsistic world in which each individual might be persuaded of the truth of his senses, yet be unable to verify the correspondence between another person's use of a language and the sense data to which his language was referring. This too seemed another breach in the wall. Berlin's paper of 1939, Verification, raised all of these objections and went on to argue that variability depends on intelligibility and not vice versa. There were statements which were intelligible, but which could not be verified, and this logical positivism could not explain. His papers were among the most penetrating critique that logical positivism received before the war. It was good enough. The problem was that this kind of a philosophy, with its scientific bias, is a lack of interest in ethical, historical, and political questions, began to seem like a cul-de-sac. By the time one of his last articles in the analytical style, Logical Translation, was published in 1950, skepticism towards logical positivism was shading into sarcasm. The article is an attack on the reductive consequences of searching for incongruable propositions. The search for such arid islands of certainty was a waste of time. The more precise one's language became, the less it could actually say. Quote, to say anything significantly about the world, we must bring in something other than immediate experience, whatever immediate may mean, namely the past and the future, and absent objects and other persons, and unrealized possibilities and general and hypothetical judgments, and so forth. And if these, because we cannot certify them as certain, are cut away, in the end, literally nothing will be left. We cannot speak without incurring some risk, at least in theory. The only way of being absolutely safe is to say absolutely nothing. End quote. In reaction to logical positivism, his own cast of minds became ever more historical. He had a strong sense, as Bernard Williams had put it, that no abstract or analytical point exists after all connection with a historical, personal thought, that every thought belongs, not just somewhere, but to someone, and is at home in a context of other thoughts, a context which is not purely formally prescribed. This habit of mind made Berlin increasingly impatient with the disembodied character of a philosophical discussion and directed him not away from philosophy, but towards a philosophy grounded in the history of ideas. The Marx biography began as a dutiful exercise without much sense of where it might lead, gradually opened up a wider universe in which Isaiah felt he genuinely belonged in the history of ideas. It was the Marx project that rescued him from what was, at least for him, the dead end of philosophy at Oxford. If the narrowly philosophical period of his time was brief, it is worth asking what residual it left in his mature work. He always insisted on the cleansing properties of analytical philosophy. It got rid of a lot of clouds of Hegelianism, which were no good. It was a great rejuvenating force. Quote and unquote. But he was utterly unconvinced by logical positivism's redefinition for philosophy as the handmaiden of science. Philosophy's naive province, he later wrote, was the permanent or semi-permanent categories in terms of which experience is conceived and classified. As a permanent or semi-permanent suggests, the subject matter of a philosophy was historical. It was an unavoidable characteristic of such models and categories of thought that they changed over time. For Ayer and the positivists, the historicity of human thought was an incidental or uninteresting feature. For Berlin, it raised the central problem of philosophy itself, whether the idea of continuous, stable human values could be reconciled with the manifest historical variation in the way these values were expressed across time, across cultures, and between individuals within cultures. The emphasis on values, moreover, returned ethics and political philosophy to center stage. As Isaiah's thoughts about academic philosophy grew, some of the young Turks believed that he was ducking the difficult analytical questions for pleasant excursions into more congenial 19th century terrain. This objection was put in its sharpest form by Stuart Hampshire, a brilliant, tall, and handsome Balliol undergraduate, elected as a Fellow of All Souls in 1936. As Hampshire's own intellectual confidence increased, and as he fell ever more deeply under the spell of logical positivism, so his impatience grew with what he called Isaiah's period talking. In a scathing letter written in 1937, Hampshire took his friend to task for writing too vaguely about generalized states of mind, the spirit of this and that zeitgeist. It was all very unpositivist and unrealistic, and his history of ideas was being undermined by recourse to vague Hegelian-styled generalities. Hampshire's letter remained the most effective methodological critique of Isaiah's work. It also defined the curiously tense character of their relationship as friends. Hampshire, the younger man, taking upon himself the role of intellectual and political conscience for his older, less precise, more wide-ranging friend. In the acknowledgments of Berlin's book on Marx, Hampshire is thanked, along with Ayer and Rakhmilevich, for his comments, but it is not clear to what degree Isaiah ever changed his views or approach as a result of Hampshire's often critical advice. He went his own way. Most of the essential questions that were to occupy his later life were not even suggested by Oxford analytical philosophy. They were seated in Berlin's mind as a result of the apparently casual or contingent process by which a good mind picks up hints and phrases in the thoughts of others and makes of these a life's work. Two basic predispositions that values might be incompatible, and that human beings were not indefinitely malleable, took root very early. Already in a letter to Elizabeth Bowen, written in November 1933, we find Berlin noticing that the philosopher Malebranche had observed that since the moral ends which human beings commonly pursued were in conflict with each other, the very idea of creating a perfect society was incoherent. This seminal idea had also cropped up elsewhere. Hadn't Kant said, he wrote to Bowen, that after the crooked timber of humanity no straight thing was ever made? These were the chance of encounters with ideas, not the fevered discussions with Ayer and Austin, that generated his later thought. And it was in his solitary reading, not in his reaction to criticism from Hampshire, that his mature thought slowly took shape. Characteristically, Berlin never let Hampshire's criticism dampen their friendship. Before his election to All Souls, Hampshire had shared rooms in Beaumont Street with two other undergraduates, and together they had run a high-brow discussion group called the Florentine Club, to which fashionable dons like Maurice Barra and Isaiah had been invited. T.S. Eliot had come to one of these gatherings in Beaumont Street in 1934, and Isaiah had surprised the company by talking knowledgeably with Eliot about the German poet Wilhelm Busch, whose work Isaiah, in his mysterious way, was the only person in Oxford to have read. Berlin made Hampshire feel caricaturally English and provincial by comparison. Yet instead of being put off by Isaiah's European learning and ceaseless talk, he was strongly drawn to him. After a picnic lunch in the summer of 1936, at which Isaiah gobbled black olives and seemed, to Hampshire's amusement, to ignore the English countryside altogether, they became close friends. Hampshire's elusive discretion and shy uprightness led Isaiah to nickname his friend the Ghazali. In the summer of 1937, Hampshire and Berlin traveled through Ireland together. They were rowed up to the Blasket Islands in a coracle, sat beside peat fires, and listened to the islanders singing, then contributed a quivering rendition of the All Souls song to the evening's festivals. They continued on their journey on Irish country buses, during which Hampshire remembered Isaiah amused himself by reading Flaubert's Ballade de Boccace in Russian. Sorry, I cannot pronounce that French name of Flaubert. They visited Bowen's court in late July, with the writer Rosamond Lehmann and Cromwell Rees, and watched as Cromwell, with the verve of a matador, transferred his affections from Bowen to Lehman, the episode that Bowen took as the bitter kernel of her most famous novel, The Death of the Heart. In the summer of 1938, Berlin finally delivered a manuscript on Marx to the publishers, only to be told that he had to cut it by 25,000 words. He shut himself up in a hotel in Bellevue-sur-Mer, then at Hollycroft Avenue, which, as he candidly said, was perfect, because it was the only place where he was allowed to be bad-tempered at meals. Then, at the end of the summer, he went to Bowen's court, where Elizabeth Bowen locked him into his bedrooms every morning until lunchtime. He emerged with a manuscript squeezed down to the requisite size. In late September 1938, he took the overnight train and ferry from Ireland back to London, and shared a berth with an Irish house dealer, and leaped up onto the platform when the train stopped on the line, and bought a newspaper with banner headlines proclaiming Chamberlain's deal with Hitler at Munich. The horse dealer exclaimed, "The war is off," and went back to sleep. War did seem entirely unreal. On Berlin's return, Oxford seemed beatific in the late Indian summer light. That autumn he paid a visit to the most famous refugee from Nazi Europe, Sigmund Freud. Freud's wife was a relative of a family friend, Oscar Philipp. Through this intermediary, Isaiah arranged to call at Maresfield Gardens on Friday afternoon in October 1938. Freud himself answered the doorbell and ushered Berlin into the famous study with the Egyptian and Greek statuettes and figurines already displayed on every free space of the desk, cabinets, and bookcases. When Freud asked Berlin what he did, and Isaiah replied in German that he attempted to teach philosophy, Freud replied sardonically, "Then you must think me as a charlatan." This was close to the mark, but Berlin protested. "Dr. Freud, how can you think such a thing?" Freud then pointed to a figurine on the mantelpiece. "Can you guess where it comes from?" When Berlin said he had no idea, Freud replied, "It comes from Megara. I see you are not pretentious." Then he explained that he had reached London thanks to the intercession of Princess Maria Bonaparte, and asked whether Isaiah was familiar with other members of the Greek royal family. When Isaiah said he wasn't, Freud replied, "I see you are not a snob." This part of the interrogation completed, Freud began musing aloud about whether he might set up his practice in Oxford. Berlin said there was bound to be a lot of demand for Dr. Freud's service in a place like Oxford, and in his mind's eye he imagined the discreet, burnished brass plaque on the Oxford doorway reading, "Dr. Freud, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., and a queue of neurotics stretching back for a mile." Then Freud's wife, a gentlewoman in her 70s, came in, with an amusing and ironical look on her face. She said, "You know my cousin Oscar. He is an observant Jew." Berlin said he was. She went on, "Every Jewish woman wants to light the Sabbath candles on Friday night, but this monster," and here she pointed at her husband, "forbids it, says it is a superstition." Freud nodded with mock gravity and said, "Religion is a superstition." This was obviously a joke sewn into the very fabric of their marriage. After this, the Freuds, their grandson Lucien, and Berlin took tea in the garden in an atmosphere which Berlin remembered was pure Vienna. Circa 1912. The old man was in the penultimate stages of cancer of the jaw, but he gave no sign of pain, discomfort, or complaint. When tea was over, Berlin departed, feeling that he had spent an hour in the company not of a genius, but of an old Jewish doctor, clever, malicious, and wise. Of great consequence to Isaiah's later life was his meeting in early 1939 with another patriarch, the leader of the Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann. They met in the palatial Park Lane apartment of Mrs. Israel Schaef, at a meeting of the Friends of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Herbert Samuel, High Commissioner of Palestine, addressed the group, and Isaiah was asked to give a brief speech and thanks to the hostess, Mrs. Schaef. He was a young Don, unused to such grand settings, and as he rose to speak, had to fight the impulse to say that the most important thing about Mrs. Schaef was that she was very, very rich. After avoiding this embarrassment, he was presented to Weizmann, who, on discovering that Isaiah spoke Russian, invited him to tea at the Dorchester Hotel. Weizmann, he immediately thought, was a kind of a genius, at least in his dealings with human beings, a great flirt with a very velvety, extremely seductive voice. Cozy he was not, but jolly, cynical, funny, and not at all kind. He loved telling the story of how in 1915 he was stopped in a Moscow street by a policeman, who asked him what he was doing in the city. When Weizmann replied that he was working for the Jews, the policeman said in a confidential whisper, "Watch out, they will kill you." Weizmann would then add with a comic growl, "He was right, of course, they will kill me." This sardonic and ironic relationship to Jewishness drew Berlin to him immediately. They met at a low ebb in Zionist fortunes, the Peel Commission report on the future of Palestine, commissioned after the Arab uprising of 1936, had recommended partition, which Weizmann's Jewish agency accepted, but the Arabs rejected out of hand. A conference in London in February and March 1939 failed to resolve the deadlock. Then, in May 1939, the British government published a white paper proposing the establishment, over the next decade, of a unitary Palestinian state in which Arabs and Jews would share authority. For a 5-year period, 75,000 Jewish immigrants would be allowed. After 1943, further immigrants would be banned. Both Arabs and Jews angrily rejected the white paper. Jews were particularly outraged by the ban on further immigration, despite the obvious evidence that Hitler had placed all of Europe European Jewry in mortal peril. Weizmann and Berlin discussed the available options for the Jewish agency, with Weizmann pessimistically concluding that if he ever lived to see the Promised Land, it would probably be in a British concentration camp. With the declaration of war in September 1939, Isaiah, like all his Oxford colleagues, volunteered for war work. Immediately he was given a small but galling reminder of his foreignness. He was offered the humble post of a letter censor, but when it was discovered that he was born in Latvia, the offer was withdrawn. While Freddie Ayer, Stuart Hampshire, and John Austin went off to war as young officers, Berlin had to remain disconsolately in Oxford, gathering with the wives of departed sons in the town hall to assemble gas masks and roll bandages. His remarks appeared at the outbreak of war in the Home University Library series. It was mildly praised in the Times Literary Supplement, and the major figures of Oxford, G.D.H. Cole, Master Lindsay of Balliol, all approved of it, though Lindsay did say that Berlin had neglected to emphasize the Hebrew prophet side of Marx. Berlin thought this ridiculous, as if a figure should be regarded as a Hebrew prophet simply because he was Jewish and wore a long beard. Left-wing reviews were more hostile, though the Daily Worker did grant that the work was superior to the usual reactionary trash put out by the bourgeois. High praise indeed. The book was gone through 4 editions and is still in print. Its defects are obvious enough. Berlin never mastered Marx's economic theory in Das Kapital. Yet he took pride in getting inside the head of an antipathetic figure, and in a large sense, the sojourn with Marx had a profound influence on his later thought. It gave him a lifelong target, for he genuinely loathed Marxian ideas of historical determinism and was to argue that they served as the chief ideological excuse of Stalin's crimes. At the same time, he was influenced by the Marxian sense that ideas and values were historical, and that the values of social groups in class struggle were incompatible. Marxism accentuated his tendency to look historically at the values that liberals of his generation took as eternal verities. For the duration of the phony war, through the winter of 1940, Berlin remained gloomily teaching at Oxford. Afterwardly, the place remained the same. Borrower still told the same old jokes. David Cecil still ran in and out of Isaiah's rooms, gabbling with a voice like a crowd of hens being carried across a field, while a certain Son Foyd was maintained in the senior common rooms. Oxford was rife with rumors that the government in Whitehall was about to be evacuated there. Once the invasion of France began, Isaiah began to have very real fears for his own safety, as he wrote to Felix Frankfurter, quote, "I'm not a soldier and cannot be one, and I'm in certain respects highly exposed, if only because I'm a Jew and have written on Marx. I should do my best not to be caught. If I could induce some institution in the U.S. to invite me, I would. But the cold-blooded flight is monstrous." End quote. On 12 June 1940, As the Germans broke through the French lines and Paris lay open before their advance, Berlin went to deliver a paper on other minds to the Moral Sciences Club in Cambridge. In Oxford, the imminent fall of France was on everyone's mind. In Cambridge, the otherworldliness of the Dons was unreal. All of the Cambridge philosophers turned out. Braithwaite, Broad, Ewing, Moore, Wisdom, and a sixth figure, small and handsome of a feature, who appeared surrounded with acolytes in tweed jackets and white, open-necked shirts identical to his own. This was Ludwig Wittgenstein. Berlin delivered his paper on the problem of how one could have knowledge of others' inner mental states. It was, he remembered, terribly boring. After a few initial questions, Wittgenstein became impatient and took over the discussion. Berlin remembered him saying, No, that's not the way to go about it at all. Let's talk philosophy. Let's talk business with each other. Ordinary business. In ordinary circles, I say to you. You see a clock? The minute hand and the hour hand are both nailed to the clock face to certain ciphers. The whole face goes around, but the time remains the same. No, that's a solipsism. It was idiotic, Wittgenstein was saying, to claim that time had stopped simply because the hands of the clock remained motionless. Time changed whatever the clocks, whatever the sense data happened to record. This was a vintage demolition of Ayer's type of verificationism. No one else spoke. Broad sat there like a boiled lobster looking angry. G. Moore, old and decrepit, looked open-mouthed. Isaiah parred as best he could, and the acolytes hung on every word and dared not interrupt. After an hour, Wittgenstein rose to his feet. His acolytes rose with him, and he leaned over the table and shook Isaiah's hands. Very interesting discussion. Thank you. With that, he walked out. Other participants crowded around and said how rare it was to be complimented in this way. But Berlin was not fooled. Wittgenstein hadn't been much impressed with the paper or with Isaiah's arguments afterwards. But he did seem to think that Berlin had been honest and sincere, not trying to show off, as Freddie Ayer might have done. Wittgenstein's judgment was Berlin's own, and their encounter marked the symbolic, if not the actual, end of Isaiah's active philosophical career. After the Blue, in May-June 1940, Guy Burgess appeared in Berlin's rooms at All Souls and suggested that they go to Russia together. Isaiah had known Burgess since early 1934, when they met at the Rothschilds in Cambridge in company with Anthony Blunt. He immediately liked Burgess. He seemed amusing, energetic, vulgar but irrepressible Trinity undergraduate. They kept in touch throughout in 1930s. It was an attraction of opposites. The fastidious, rather repressed Don and the disheveled homosexual adventurer. Isaiah watched with some fascination as Burgess navigated his way into a job at a conservative central office, then onto a city newsletter offering investors advice, then into writing speeches for the Conservative MP, then into working for Radio Luxembourg. All the while, he reveled in the London lowlife and the tales of his escapades afforded Isaiah much vicarious enjoyment. Burgess would suddenly descend on Oxford from London and ring up from the Mitre, the hotel up the High Street from All Souls, proposing to visit. Some transient male friend in tow. Isaiah would order Burgess to leave his friend at the Mitre, break out the whiskey, and he and Burgess would talk into the small hours, never about politics, but mostly about books, cinema, and music. Berlin had no inkling of Burgess' deeper and darker involvements. Sometime in 1938, however, Isaiah heard that Burgess had joined Britannia Youth, a neo-fascist group that used to send British schoolboys to Nazi rallies in Germany. Hearing this, Isaiah broke off all contact with him. In June 1940, a sober and businesslike Burgess arrived in Oxford. He explained away his temporary sojourn with the neo-fascists. Quote, "I'm terribly unstable. It just came over me. Everything in England was so dreary. I thought at least the Nazis knew where they were going. Anyway, I don't expect you to forgive me." End quote. But Isaiah did. Burgess then announced that he was bound for Russia on a mission for M15. He had proposed to his mentor and protector, Harold Nicolson, then in a senior position at the Ministry of Information, that Isaiah, since he had fluent Russian, be appointed as a press officer at the British Embassy in Moscow. Isaiah, still smarting from being turned down for war work as a foreigner, increasingly frightened that the Germans might overrun Britain, and desperate to do something of credit in the war, leaped at the chance. On several occasions during the 1930s, he had said how much he wanted to go to Russia. Now he had his opportunity. Burgess rapidly arranged visits to Glavin Jeb at the Foreign Office and Nicholson at the Ministry of Information. Both seemed to encourage the idea of a joint mission to Moscow. A visa to Russia would be required, but that could be procured on the way. Of the available routes to Russia, the easiest went through the west coast ports of America to Vladivostok. In July 1940, in company with Guy Burgess, Isaiah set off by boat for Montreal, bound, so he thought, for Moscow.